Hello. This time I'd like to introduce this book, Sir Ernest Satow's Private Letters to W.G. Aston and F.V. Dickins, the correspondence of a pioneer Japanologist from 1870 to 1918, edited by me with an introduction by Professor Peter Kornicki. Well, first of all, we got some quite good illustrations here. There's one of Satow in 1869, and then visiting a Japanese house and with Austrian diplomat Baron Hübner. There's another Japanese house, Foreign Minister Sawa, and this one is 1900, between Japan and China. And then there's one of diplomats standing outside the Spanish legation, and then Satow in Vanity Fair, done by Spy in 1903. And then the two addressees of the letters in this volume, William George Aston and Frederick Victor Dickins. So what we have is my preface followed by the introduction, and then the actual content in terms of letters is PRO 30/30 or 30/33. 11.2 and 11.3 are Satow to Aston. PRO 30/33, 11.5, 6, and 7 are Satow to Dickins. So Satow to Aston begins in 1870 and ends in 1909 with Aston's death. And Satow to Dickins begins in 1877 and ends in 1918 after Dickens's death, which was, I think, 1915. Then I've got a couple of appendices and a select bibliography and an index. Okay, so I'm now going to read my preface and then read the introduction by Professor Kornicki. So, author's preface. It gives me much pleasure to be able to publish these important diaries of Sir Ernest Satow, 1843 to 1929, written in the period 1870 to 1918, to his two great friends, W.G. Aston and F.V. Dickins, as part of a sustained effort over more than a decade to make the Satow papers more easily available to scholars and the general reading public. It is hoped that some hitherto unresolved issues relating to this distinguished scholar diplomat may be cleared up thanks to this publication. For example, Japanese scholars of Satow, beginning with the late Nobutoshi Hagihara, 1926 to 2001, their doyen, who first discovered the Satow papers at the old Public Record Office, sometimes seem to express puzzlement as to why Satow should have effectively turned his back on Japan, but not his Japanese family, in retirement. One answer to this conundrum is surely provided by the relative lack of information and news about Japan, which would have been available to Satow in retirement at Ottery St. Mary, Devon. There was, of course, no internet in those days, and Japan was a world away despite occasional visitors. Another lies in Satow's clearly stated preference for and higher estimation of European over Japanese culture, explained by Peter Kornicki below, and yet another in the deaths of both his closest old Japonian friends, with whom he could and did discuss Japanese culture in letters, Aston in 1911 and Dickins in 1915. As for his Japanese books, he made very large collections and complained of having too many to Dickins. And already in 1881, he was planning to shut up all Asiatic books on his return to live in England. In the end, it was apparently, as with Shakespeare's Mark Antony in his funeral oration for Julius Caesar, not that Satow loved Japan less, but that he loved Europe more. Japan was delightful and fascinating as a subject of work-related study while he was there as a young man. But do not most of us, wherever we come from, ultimately value and cherish most highly the culture in which we were born and nurtured and seek to return to it? Be this as it may, Satow's deep concern for the welfare of his friends shines through in this long correspondence, and we may feel privileged to be able to eavesdrop on one side of these erudite and thoughtful exchanges. Ian Ruxton, Kyushu Institute of Technology. I should mention at this point that Professor Peter Kornicki has transcribed and annotated and published the letters from Dickins to Satow with Edition Synapse. So they are published with a Japanese publisher. All right, so now Professor Kornicki's introduction. Ernest Satow belonged to a small group of Englishmen who arrived in Japan in the middle of the 19th century and applied themselves to learning the language with remarkable results. Like William George Aston, Frederick Victor Dickins, and Basil Hall Chamberlain, Satow made his mark as a Japanologist with a range of impressive publications. But he differed from them in that he also rose to prominence in public life, with the result that his name is still the best known of them all in Japan. This was, of course, because of his dazzling diplomatic career, which took him from Japan to Siam, Thailand, Uruguay, and Morocco, and finally back to Japan as Minister Plenipotentiary, followed by 5 years in Peking in the same position. In both of those two final postings, he was head of mission, for neither post was at that time yet considered important enough to warrant an ambassador. He was also showered with honors. On his last visit to Japan, on his way home, after relinquishing his post in Peking, he was received by Emperor Meiji and entertained by all the leading statesmen of the day, mostly men he had known as young men when he had been in Japan in the 1860s. In Britain, he was knighted GCMG, awarded an honorary doctorate at Cambridge, and made a member of the Privy Council. As an indication of his standing in foreign affairs and diplomacy, it is worth remembering that his monumental A Guide to Diplomatic Practice appeared in 1917. It remained a standard work of reference for young diplomats and was frequently revised and updated, the last edition appearing as late as 1957. Well, actually, there have been several editions since then, and we're currently awaiting, I believe, the 8th edition. Although Satow has thus many and varied claims to distinction, his correspondence reveals an abiding involvement with and interest in Japan throughout his life, and this is particularly so with the correspondence contained in this volume, for his correspondents were pioneer Japanologists like him. Although Dickins left Japan in 1879 and Aston in 1889, neither ever to return, they both continued to write on Japan in their retirement. It was, in fact, during those years of retirement that they produced some of their finest work as scholars of Japan, such as Aston's History of Japanese Literature, 1899, and Shinto, The Way of the Gods, 1905, and Dickens' The Old Bamboo Hewer Story, 1889, Primitive and Medieval Japanese Texts, 1906, and The Story of a Hida Craftsman, 1912. While they occupied their years back in England with scholarship on Japan, Satow was traveling the world as an increasingly high-ranking member of the British diplomatic service. But that he too retained a scholarly interest in Japan is obvious. For example, from his correspondence with Dickins, in which we read of their speculations about the use of the Japanese word joro to mean courtesan, their interest in Japanese botany, and their criticism of the writings on Japan of lesser figures such as August Fitzmyer, W.E. Griffiths, and John Reddy Black. These and other topics, together with recollections of the Japan of their youth and reflections on contemporary Japan, are of as much interest to Satow when he is writing from Bangkok, Montevideo, and Tangier as they were when he was still writing from Japan at the beginning of his career. Nevertheless, after 1900, he wrote very little about Japan for publication, with the principal exception of a section on Japan for his chapter The Far East, 1815 to 1871, in the Cambridge Modern History, 1909. After he had left Japan to rise in the diplomatic service, there can be no doubt that he missed his life in Japan. Writing from Bangkok in 1884, he wrote, "I never think of that country without the liveliest feelings of regret. One was so happy there, in spite of the distance from England, and the traveling in the interior was so delightful." Thus, when he needed to leave Bangkok temporarily to recover from a bout of ill health, it was to Japan that he went. And yet he could also write to Dickins, "You must not regret Japan. It is not worth it." And he could claim that the Japanese are decorative, not artistic. All of these are quotations from the book. Similarly, complaining of the burden of work as head of mission in Tokyo, he wrote, "The routine work is killing me mentally, and I must come back to a higher civilization." By which it is clear from the context he was referring to Europe. Like many of his contemporaries, he was unable to escape the conviction or instinct that European civilization was unsurpassed. And thus it comes as no surprise to find him commenting on a review of Aston's History of Japanese Literature. Summed up altogether, what a very poor show Japanese literature makes. Dickens himself expressed a similar ambivalence about Japan towards the end of his life, and regretted that he had devoted his life to things Japanese. It was, in the end, impossible for any of them to become cultural relativists and discard the cultural yardsticks they held undiminished and unchallenged in their minds for their entire lives. Satow was an inveterate collector and reader of books, and the correspondence reveals much about his reading, including a number of Japanese books, which at that time, of course, were entirely woodblock printed books, printed in cursive script. In a letter to Dickens of 1877, for example, he mentions reading No plays and the 10th century poetry anthology Kokinshu. But Japanese was by no means the only language he was reading in apart from English, and readers of these letters will perhaps be taken aback by the extraordinary breadth of his reading and interests. By 1880, he was learning written and spoken Korean from a Korean resident in Japan and trying to read Korean literature. It is clear from casual references in these letters that he was regularly reading books in French, Italian, Spanish, and German as a matter of course. And in 1916, when already in his 70s, he began the study of Russian in order to read Russian diplomatic documents, and in fact to read War and Peace sent to him by his cousin Lysinka. I'm just adding that. It is worth pointing out here that the many activities, including dictionary compiling, traveling around Japan, reading, studying botany, and learning Korean that he mentions in his letters were only possible because his duties in the British legation could not be said to have been exacting. As he wrote in 1879, "We no longer sit in the chancery at fixed hours whether there is work or not, which is one of Sir Harry Parkes's favorite ways of making one waste time." Or on another occasion, "Official work is not heavy." Recalling his early days in Japan with Aston, he wrote, "We seldom had more than half a day's work each." And even when he returned to Japan as head of mission in 1895, he could afford to spend several months a year traveling or sitting quietly by Lake Chuzenji at Nikko. I've discovered that he visited Nikko 31 times in the period 1895 to 1900. And I've done a separate PowerPoint presentation about that, which is also on YouTube on my channel. Continuing with the introduction. For those who, like myself, that's Peter Kornicki, first went to Japan in the 1970s, it is not difficult to identify myriad ways in which Japanese society has changed. Gone, for example, are the smogs of the big cities and the student protesters, and no more does a foreigner's competence in Japanese astonish. But in many respects, change has been gradual and far from dramatic. The Shinkansen is a bit faster and a bit more stylish. More Japanese are likely to own and use a car. Architectural styles are more imaginative and confident. But for Satow and his contemporaries, the changes were colossal, and it requires an effort of the imagination to realize that. Arriving in Japan in 1864, he spent his first years in the Edo, that's the old name for Tokyo, in the Edo of daimyo mansions and palanquins, of two-sworded assassins, of woodblock printed books, and of single-story wooden dwellings. By the time he left, Japan had a navy powerful enough to defeat Russia, an extensive railway network, a publishing industry that used steam presses and churned out masses of newspapers, magazines, and books, and magnificent museums, exhibition halls, and other public buildings made of brick. By these dramatic changes, Satow, like his contemporaries, could not but be impressed, but there remained a deep ambivalence about Japan that none of them could shake off. Ian Ruxton's careful transcriptions of these letters offer a valuable opportunity to come face to face with that ambivalence and to see the workings of an educated mind which knew Japan intimately, but could not reconcile his European intellectual loyalties either with the Japan he experienced in the 1860s and 1870s, or with Japan as a rising power in the 20th century. Peter Kornicki, East Asia Institute, University of Cambridge, May 2007. So this book was actually published in 2007, but it's still available with this cover on Amazon and Lulu.com, and in the case of Amazon, as a Kindle and a paperback. Okay, so that's all that I have to say on this particular video. Thank you very much for watching.